Thank you very much for having me. The topic for discussion today was quite very crucial: how to ensure that sustainable finance contributes to Africa's development. And the presentation was premised on three aspects. Firstly, the African continent needs 2.5 trillion US dollars to be able to implement the Paris Climate Change Agreement. That is, to put actions in place that can be able to ensure that Africa's climate resilience is enhanced. But at the same time, Africa also needs 1.2 trillion each and every year to implement the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the bigger question then becomes, with all these astronomical amounts of money, where will Africa get these, given that Africa, when it comes to its main source of revenue, which is tax collection, it's only collecting about 500 billion each and every year. That's roughly just about 12% of the amount that they collect. When it comes to ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance, Africa can only benefit up to about 40 billion. So when you juxtapose this within the needed finance, it becomes quite very, very troubling to see where Africa would transform and at the same time ensure that they leave no one behind. And the presentation seeks to ask questions and also try to drive a narrative in which we can start to think differently, which is, can Africa leverage on the little they have to start injecting it into sectors that can bring quicker returns on investment, and sectors in which Africa have a comparative advantage on? And these sectors are no other than the agricultural sector, which Africa harbours 65% of uncultivated arable land that can produce food to feed the continent. And the other is the solar energy, where Africa have 365 days of sunshine each and every year. But if you look at these with this comparative advantage, which are captured in the agreement that all African countries sign, and 90% of them have ratified, called the Paris Agreement, agriculture and clean energy constituted 70% of their priorities that they presented. But the question then is, with them that have already ratified the Paris Agreement, 90% of them, how can they not turn the agreement that has been ratified into reality to ensure that no child goes to bed with his or her stomach aching of hunger? Because as we're speaking, there are 257 million Africans that every night go to bed hungry. As we're speaking, there are 620 million Africans that are energy impoverished. So when you look at this paradox of lack amidst plentiful opportunities, then the question then is, leveraging the finances they have got to inject them into this area of competitive advantage. And so the discussion was, if financial institutions, banks, cooperatives, microfinancial institutions, etc., can then be able to give loans to people to focus in investment in these competitive advantage sectors, the return on investment will not only be higher, but it will be able to drive socio-economic opportunities. But that investment must be climate resilient investment, not at the expense of the environment, so that we can move away from social development financing to investment financing that address the three aspects of social, economic, and environmental benefit. Africa is actually a leader when it comes to the climate change discourse, because firstly, Africa is the continent that have mostly ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement more than any other continent. That then means that Africa have understood the inherent opportunities that comes with this agreement. Africa is also a leader when it comes to putting in place their plans that they presented to this. They actually focus in the priority areas. But the biggest issue that Africa faces, and it's not just with the climate change, it's with most development agendas, whether it is the agenda on the Yamoussoukro Declaration that in 2002 was adopted and ratified by 22 African continents to ensure that the inter-air connectivity was easier. Implementation becomes a problem. Whether it is the Maputo Declaration to ensure that investment of 10% into the agricultural sector can actually be achieved by it becomes a problem. So the issue that Africa faces is hard to turn ratified agreements into reality. And that disconnect between policy and action is the issue. But what we're saying is that to drive the disconnect between policy and action, it's driven by people, and the people are the citizens. Yeah. So the continent needs to start seeing the youth as the biggest constituents for development, not just by mentioning them as youth, but by leveraging on their talents, their skills, to drive that development. And the easiest way to do that is to start retooling these youth skills so that they can become relevant and also become the constituents of development. Because let me just say this, the area of government being the custodian of developing policy, implementing policy, measuring results, at the end of the day, has actually elapsed. The people are the biggest constituency that can drive action, and the role of government is to create an enabling environment, as well as create institutions that can be able to foster transformation. Africa is also financing its development. If you take climate change, a report by the United Nations Economic Commission last year showed that Africa, when it comes to climate adaptation, Africa is contributing 20%, which is roughly about 3 billion each and every year. The bigger question should be that the little finances that Africa contributes, are they investing it in the right areas that can bring high return on investment? And the question is no. If you take infrastructure, infrastructure should not just be to build roads. It should be to connect roads to where activities are happening, for example, agricultural production. If you look in rural areas, almost 80 to 90% of the roads are unpaved. When there is flooding, people cannot be able to transport what they produce even to markets. So connecting routes to where production happens in rural areas, to where pick-ups of picking what has been produced and connecting to markets is an investment that will be helping to drive transformation, because it will be an enabler that can connect people to be able to turn what they are doing to benefit more. Having energy is not enough, because if you hear that big infrastructure, energy, clean energy, fine, that's excellent, but it's not enough. Energy for what? It should be energy not just for domestic production or domestic consumption. It should be energy to drive agro-industrialization, so that where this energy is being decentralized, should be decentralizing to where actions are happening to add value to what is produced, to ensure that you can be able to train people to leverage this energy to start helping those who are producing and having their crops rotten or get spoiled because they cannot add value. That is the kind of systematic thinking that seems to be absent, because we are talking in silos here. Energy, big energy projects. Infrastructure, big infrastructure projects, big roads. For what? These must be connected in such a way that they are responding to actions that are already happening. And the rural areas are areas that need to be created to become economic opportunity zones, not zones of despair. The future of Africa is with the youth. Your people are your biggest capital. Human capital outweighs financial and material capital. With that, investing in the people, especially the youth, Africa might never really rise. And I said this. Why? A skilled human being is 4 times the value of produced wealth and 15 times the value of natural capital. That then means if you take 1.2 billion citizens in the African continent, if you are able to skill just 700 million of these young people, the investments we are talking about will bring more returns, because the people who can then be able to do what is needed will be there. But when you have the investments without the people to drive it, you will only be having a burden that will take you nowhere. And more importantly, Africa must change the mainstream narrative of production without adding value to what they produce. Africa needs to start now pronouncing 2 words: value addition.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.